Welcome back to Kairos with one of our favourite guests who we haven't seen for a while, the Reverend Tom Peach. Welcome back, Tom.
It's fantastic to be here. I've been pining and wasting away, waiting for this moment.
We assume so. Today we are talking about another saint in the church's calendar, John of Damascus. The church remembers John on December the 4th. So, Tom, who was John of Damascus?
Well, John was a man. He lived in the 8th century, especially born in the 600s, died in the 700s, and you'll be very surprised to know he lived in Damascus as well.
Good to hear.
And he, before we get into his life, it's good to set the context of what's going on in that area at that time because it's really relevant to who John is and what he does. He was born some decades after Muhammad is said to have died. The dates are a bit fuzzy there too, but in that era, after Muhammad dies, the Arab invasions happen. So Arabs who live in the Arabian Peninsula, start spreading out and conquering lands, especially lands that were formerly Christian. They take over what we call the Holy Land around Israel, and they go up north, Syria and Lebanon, into Asia Minor, Turkey we call it now. They're turned back at Constantinople by Greek fire. That's another story, but they have this great technology like napalm almost. But they also then take over other Christian lands in Egypt, in North Africa. Arabs go into Spain. They even go into France. They're turned back by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours. And this happens even during John's lifetime, that these battles are going on, Christian territories are being lost, and it's hard to sort of gauge what a big deal this was for early Christianity.
It's hard to imagine living in the midst of all of that.
It's the most cataclysmic event that had happened to Christianity, you'd say. Only one angle, but one angle is that Christianity had really grown up till that point. It had taken over new territory, more converts, more growth. There were Christians like Eusebius who had arguments saying Christianity is true because it's growing, because we're the ones obviously blessed by God, and so we're taking over the world. You couldn't make that argument anymore. And these places that the Arabs took over were not just sort of marginal areas of Christianity. In some ways, they are the seats of Christianity. Alexandria, the great city, which was really a great powerhouse of intellectual thought among Christians, but also North Africa, which had really a lot of really faithful, rigorous, strong Christians who had really made a huge influence around the whole of Christendom. But then the Holy Lands also, where you had people had been rebuilding and commemorating the sites where Jesus was born and where he died. And it was just all
of a sudden it's all in enemy hands.
And John lives in this. He's born as a Christian, in a Christian family, but in territories that are now Islamic. And he was actually from a well-to-do family who had served in government. And as it so happens, when the Arabs took over, they didn't always have the manpower to govern. It was, in some ways, quite surprising how quickly they took over territories, and they weren't always prepared with a government in waiting, and they often would employ Christians who were very proficient at running things, and John serves in this role in high office into probably till around about 50 years old, following his sort of family tradition. He even has like an Islamic name, Yohanna ibn Mansur. So he's right in this Arabic context, and at 50 years old, roughly, he resigns. It's probably because the tensions of being a faithful Orthodox Christian in the midst of this new Islamic territory got too much. He becomes a monk. He doesn't actually leave the Islamic territory, though. He goes down to Bethlehem, and there's a monastery just near there that he becomes a monk and a priest, and he lives the rest of his life there.
So a bit of a late bloomer.
A late bloomer, he is, yeah. And
In terms of Christian ministry and theology, I mean.
Yeah, well, in terms of a vocation, let's say, I think he was writing during, engaged at least during his public office times, but he writes especially then in his monastic context. But sometimes on these videos we talk about what kind of example can the saints be for us today. There are people who take men who take a late vocation into the ministry after having a professional career. John of Damascus is your man, because this is the route that he takes. He also, some people have to serve in areas where their consciences are troubled.
Yep.
And John's an interesting one, because he also he pulls up stumps. He calls it a day after a while, puts up with it, and that too is a interesting thing for us to reflect on and be inspired by his courage in doing this too.
And when you talk to people in those situations, it often does seem to be a point of Christian discernment. Often some people can hang in longer than others, and there's not always a clear line as to when you leave and when you hang in there, and all of that. And so it's interesting that he was able to do it for a time, and what changed is perhaps lost to history, but yeah, there came a time. Working within an Islamic world too is applicable for many Christians in different parts of the world today, of course, and presumably the way his theology developed and the way his writings came about was interacting with that context, and that was significant in the legacy he's left. Yeah,
very much so. So one of his sort of major work has a section on philosophy, a section then on heresy, and a section then on the Orthodox faith. And the section on heresy includes Islam, that he considers Islam to be a heresy and not a new religion, but actually a poorly formed attempt at a Christian expression, a heretical expression, and that itself is quite influential and continues to be reflected upon. That in early days, these were not two different religions so much, but were considered really, this was one more heresy, and Christians had lots of heresies, and this is another one. And that was the opinion throughout the Middle Ages. Dante has Muhammad as a Christian heretic. Dante's full of pictures, and Dante has him with his belly cut in half and his guts are coming out. But I think it's because he rent asunder the body of Christendom, that this is the kind of picture that Dante has from memory. Luther considered a heresy.
I first read this, in our own Lutheran writings, and it was surprising to me. It never really made sense to me until the first time I actually got through the Quran. I didn't actually read it, but I listened to an audio version of it. And you don't realize until you do that just how polemical the Quran is. Like it's always going back to Judaism and Christianity and deliberately talking about things in the Bible or in the tradition of the Christian faith and just twisting them or taking them a different direction or saying that's not quite right, it's like this. And you just, as soon as I listened to that, I was like, now I completely get why it was seen in the first place as just a Christian heresy rather than something brand new.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a huge, interesting level of scholarship that's going on right now about trying to unpack exactly what early Islam was and looked like. You have all these strange things. Early mosques actually were oriented towards Jerusalem, not Mecca. And it took some time for then Mecca to have, well, why is that the case? And a number of other curious features as well that are, a really fascinating part of study. But in John's life, the main issue, and the main issue why John is remembered and the main issue why Islam is important in this is because Islam has famously banned images of holy people.
Yep.
We might know this today from the Muhammad cartoons and other images of of Muhammad. They call the Prophet Muhammad, who was
huge controversies even in our day. Yep.
Exactly, and I'm the historian, so it's interesting that it wasn't always the case that Islam banned images. The Adelaide Art Gallery actually has a painting, an Islamic painting of Muhammad, and that it's because some traditions would be okay with doing this, and in the Adelaide Art Gallery it's behind a curtain and you have to sort of have this little pulley rope that you can open up to reveal the image because they want to protect it from Islamic people who will be offended to see it if they walk into a room without knowing what's there. And but this infiltrates during John's lifetime into Christian theology as well. So Christians begin thinking, ought we have images of sacred people?
Isn't there something about that in our Bible too? Maybe?
Isn't there something about graven images as well? And what's interesting too is that the discussion is never really about art so much. It's about Christ. Who is Christ? And some of them had said, look, are you trying to portray the divinity? Well, the divinity can't be portrayed. Or are you just displaying the humanity? In which case, you're separating his humanity from his divinity. And these were the arguments going around. Others sort of had this kind of ethical argument saying actually the best image of Christ is a life well lived. This is how you make an icon of Christ, is love God and love your neighbour and be faithful. And this is what we should be focusing on.
The New Testament talks about the image of Christ in these terms, I think, formed in Christians to some extent.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And indeed, the early centuries of Christianity didn't have a huge amount of visual art, partly because it was a bit secretive at times as well. And it flourished in the centuries after that, leading up to John's time. And so it was a crucial moment. And it was indeed around the time when John became a monk, when he left his vocation in the public service, that the emperor banned, he didn't so much ban icons, I think, but the veneration of icons. But there were many places too that would ban representation of icons altogether. And this was a really big issue at the time. And John wrote 3 treatises, 3 discourses, defending icons, defending the visual representation of Christ. Not just saying we're allowed to do it, but almost that we're demanded, expected to do it. And his argument is really fascinating. He brings it all back to the incarnation. He says that Christ is one, both human and divine, that ever since, now that Christ has come into the world in this way, the image of the invisible God is a man, as Colossians puts it. And the word in the New Testament for image is icon. The icon of the invisible God is actually a flesh and blood person that we can see, or that could be seen at least, that could be beheld. And Jesus often talks about even people who see him, and sight is actually a decent part. And so part of John's theology is this sort of tangible, touching, sensory dimension to the faith. The unity is that actually when we do depict Christ, we are depicting the divinity. This is just the utter mystery of Christmas, that and the incarnation, or the Annunciation, even better probably, that actually when we see an image of Christ, what are we looking at? We're looking actually, it's a representation, but it's a representation of God himself and his flesh. You can't separate them out. This isn't just a picture of what some Galilean man looked like 2,000 years ago. This is actually also the image of God. This is the picture of God, and so this became really crucial in his defense of icons.
And it strikes me as one of those issues in Christian history where you wouldn't have necessarily thought that this issue of whether you can just have a picture of Christ was going to just run so deep into to show up these theological tensions. I remember when this struck me when I was at a Christian community in Europe that uses icons, and the guy was giving a talk on this, and he got them all out, beautiful, displayed them, and he says, "Thou shalt not make graven images." He pulled them all in, put them all back in his bag. There's a lot of Protestants there as well and everything, and so it was quite, everyone was quite interested in this. And then he just started talking about the incarnation for a good half an hour, and then he started getting the icons out again. And you just by the way he did it, it just got this exact point across so powerfully to me, and it just all connected in my brain, just exactly as you're describing. If Christ is really, if the Son of God has really become enfleshed in a human being, then how can we not, represent him in wood and paint and?
Yeah, and the whole iconographic tradition is really fascinating, because even there wasn't actually anything Isaiah says in Jesus's form that distinguished him.
Right.
He was a man, and think even Judas needed a kiss to show who he was. He wasn't eminently. It was
7 foot tall one with looks better than everyone else.
Exactly right. But that itself is the power, right, of the incarnation. And so John says things like, we don't worship matter. He wanted to say we're not idol worshippers. We're not worshipping matter, but we worship the God who made matter and who also has become matter, but has become material for us. And so this became sort of this sort of key Christological dimension to his defense of icons. He did also distinguish, and in English we'd say, he said we can venerate icons, never worship them. Worship belongs to God alone. The icons are there to be venerated. And you see this especially in the Orthodox tradition in a really strong way. In the Lutheran tradition, though, too, Luther argues quite similarly, very similarly, really, to John of Damascus, when he comes out of hiding to when Karlstadt in Wittenberg is destroying statues, and Luther actually demands they stay and demands they remain. And Lutherans have always had this tradition of visual depictions. And in our churches, often it's Christ on the cross. It's the corpus of Christ that we actually think, no, we do represent this. And when we're representing Christ on the cross, it's not just as a man, but actually this is also a God man. This is his divinity is also a part of this representation too.
So John of Damascus, this great legacy of developing this theology, defending the use of images representing Christ, especially in the context of this Islamic world. And any last things you want to mention for today about his legacy?
There's much more. He wrote some hymns that are still sung today in some Lutheran hymnals, but in other denominations and churches as well. He really wrote, as I briefly referenced, a book called The Orthodox Faith, almost like a systematic theology. Aquinas loved it. Martin Chemnitz, the Lutheran that we've just talked about on this show before, he would reference it from time to time, and in it John gives really rich sort of biblical testimony that we can only know anything about God because it's actually given to us in Scripture. He's got this really strong kind of the centrality of Scripture and the Word that was divinely revealed to us is the heart of his sort of theological reflection. I mean, I think of another example of just thinking of application too. It's really only after his death that his writings on images are exonerated or upheld at the Seventh Ecumenical Council in Nicaea. And there's something there too for him in his own quiet way, being faithful, writing the truth, bearing witness to Christ, no matter his context, be it Islamic, be it Christians who are denying this as well. He goes about his task faithfully. And it's not that you do that so that you may be praised after you're dead, but nevertheless, there is some kind of a rich encouragement here as well to be faithful unto death, not looking to the audience, and even when everything's against you, to still reflect, not just speak into the human community in some political sense, but actually to reflect on the Scriptures, on divine things, and to teach in a faithful, joyous way that Christ has taken on matter for our sake.
Yeah, and to trust that whatever's done in the Lord's name is never done in vain.
Indeed.
It bears fruit.
Indeed.
But I think that'll do us for today. So thank you, Tom, for sharing with us about John of Damascus today, December 4th. This is Kairos. God bless you.